we're not prepared to fiddle while Rome burns. We're prepared to launch and have begun what we regard as an all-out war on acid rain.
Well, acid rain is essentially a mixture of strong sulfuric and nitric acids that's created by the oxidation of gaseous compounds of oxides of sulfur and nitrogen that largely come out of smokestacks from fossil fuel combustion.
On Channel 17 Reports this week, we'll examine the issue of acid rain, which has killed life in hundreds of freshwater lakes in the Adirondacks and in northern Ontario. Many believe the source of the airborne acids originates in coal-burning power plants in the Midwest. The problem is threefold: our nation's position of relaxed emission standards, New York State's lawsuits to tighten up those standards, and the creation of an international dilemma. More than 100 environmentalists, scientists, and representatives of government and industry from the United States and Canada converged on the University of Buffalo Amherst campus last weekend for a two-day conference on the problem of acid rain and its implications for international policy. Sponsored by the Canadian-American Center of UB, the conference focused particularly on the economic, social, and political aspects of acid rain. The United States sees acid rain apparently as only a problem, but Canada looks at it as a crisis.
To those who doubt the seriousness of acid rain, I extend an invitation to come to our country and see for themselves. In fact, one of you got ahead of me today in suggesting that to Senator Moynihan at the earlier session. In Canada, they will find signs of the depredations of several million tons of sulfur dioxide and oxides of nitrogen, at least half of which is of U.S. origin, which are transformed chemically in the atmosphere in fall in our country each year in the form of acid rain. Many of our lakes have reached levels of acidity which make it impossible to support fish and related forms of life. In Nova Scotia, no less than 9 rivers no longer support the salmon population.
Nearly 10% of Ontario's economic base comes from the aquatic-based tourism and outdoor recreation industries. In 1980, those direct expenditures in those areas were conservatively estimated at $900 million. Consider this: tens of thousands of our lakes, in fact it's estimated in the range of 48 to 50,000 conservatively, in these recreational areas are sensitive to the insidious damage of acid rain. A U.S. Environmental Protection Agency report in July of last year concluded that Canada receives 2 to 4 times as much sulfur dioxide and 11 times as much nitrogen oxides as the United States gets from Canada. In Ohio alone, the 11 largest thermal power plants currently emit about 2.3 million tons of sulfur dioxide into our common airshed.
Now, we are having, I believe, some strained relations between the United States and Canada. You are a Canadian.
That's right, I am. I'm a resident alien in the United States.
Now, what is your feeling on the Canadian connection? Are the Canadians justified in being upset?
I think they are. There's no question that their landscape is much more sensitive than ours on average, and they are downwind of many of the major U.S. sources, so that much of their problem originates from the United States. The balance of transport is from us to them rather than from them to us.
Does it always appear in rain and snow?
No, there's a major component that comes as so-called dry deposition, when the sulfur oxides are absorbed by wet foliage, by soils and so on, things of that sort. That's very difficult to measure, and that's giving us real problems because there's a lot of acid falling that we can't document in acid rain.
Now, why is it a problem today?
It's a problem largely at the moment because it's acidifying our lakes, lessening the diversity of the kinds of organisms that live in those lakes, and especially it is eliminating fish populations. Many of the sport fish populations are very sensitive to acid rain.
Does it have an impact on human health or agriculture?
We have very little evidence for an impact on agriculture, although Professor Hutchinson today suggested that rains can damage foliage of crop plants and may in fact affect the pollination of flowers of crop plants. But by and large, crops are not nearly so heavily impacted as lakes.
Is acid rain flowing in from Ohio and the Midwestern states having any effect on Western New York?
Undoubtedly, it probably is. Unfortunately, acid rain is not something like water pollution that you can easily trace. When the emissions come from a power plant, for example, the emissions can stay in the atmosphere for a week, maybe 2 to 3 weeks, and then come down over a very, very large area.
In addition to acidification of lakes, what other damage could be done here in Western New York from an acid rain?
Well, for example, it might hurt the grape industry. That would be highly probable, and certainly the grapes are a very important crop in Western New York.
How about the paint finishing on our vehicles?
Well, I suspect that might have a problem too. Acid precipitation has acid in it, as the term suggests, and one of the acids is sulfuric acid. And if you know anything about chemistry, you don't want to come in frequent contact with sulfuric acid.
Does anyone know if it's causing a health problem?
There's some speculation that it does, but it's probably premature to indicate exactly what that health effect is. The difficulty is being able to trace people's health problems with the cause of that problem. And it may be acid precipitation, but it's very, very difficult to say for certain that that is the case.
Basically, the DEC has taken the position that a significant part, the most significant part of the acid rain issue in New York State is actually an interstate problem. And we are, in fact, experiencing transport of the contaminants which result in the acid emissions from the Ohio and Tennessee Valley areas.
We hear from EPA officials in Ohio that claim that it's no problem. Their emissions are not causing acid rain.
They're wrong. And Ohio, of course, has large areas of soil that are not susceptible to acid rain, so they're not feeling the problem directly. They're causing a problem downwind in the New England states. One thing I didn't mention in your previous question about human health, again, we have no convincing evidence, but there is suggestive evidence that acid sulfate particles that are precursors of acid rain may indeed cause respiratory problems.
Now, we've talked to the legislators in the Ohio Valley, and as well as an economic problem, economic equity, it's environmental disequity. We understand that when we say to them, there's an acid rain problem, they say, acid what? Acid who? Acid where? The answer, though, means that the Midwest is going to have to spend, the central Midwest is going to have to spend some money to lower sulfur emissions. Now, at this point in time, the Midwest doesn't even admit that sulfur emissions are a problem. And I would agree with them. If I had their strategy, I wouldn't admit that there was even the word acid rain. I'd take it out of the dictionary, because they're in a no-win situation, a no-win economic situation.
I can understand how they're trying to protect their own position in this litigation and in this matter, but that's unfortunately not the case. And one of the things we're saying is that if they want to continue to produce energy by using coal, they can do that and still maintain a decent environment, but they have to put in scrubbers and utilize existing technology, which we now know is capable of diminishing the amount of sulfur dioxide that would be spewed into the air, and which does so much damage.
Is your country restricting such emissions?
Absolutely. We have imposed on certainly our major sources, for example, the International Nickel Company in Sudbury, which is the largest single source in North America, very stringent restrictions that are going to cost that particular company in the neighborhood of $400 million to implement. They have already reduced their emissions by close to 50% over the last decade, and have another 22% reduction to meet by the beginning of 1983. Ontario Hydro, our
principal utility in terms of the provision of electric power, is under a control order now to reduce emissions, the first major step by 1985. It's going to cost them about $500 million to do that, and by 1990 they will have reduced their emissions by about 43% and have to live with that ceiling from there on.
Now, President Reagan is proposing the easing of the imposed pollution standards. Does this bother you in any way?
Yes, it does indeed. I think we're in for a major attack on the Clean Air Act to roll back the stringency of the standards. I think that will be disastrous.
Speaking of standards, it seems like a double standard now. We have our state EPA calling for certain restrictions, and yet the U.S. EPA seems to be doing nothing about easing the problem in some of the Midwestern states.
Well, I suspect they're reflecting the pressures on them from some of the emitting states that aren't seeing the problems. And, of course, your EPA can take a much more interested view of your own problems.
I think a major part of the problem is the perception of the problem. Is it a problem worthy of the money and effort necessary to clean it up? And until that question is answered, we're going to have these apparent conflicts in policy.
The argument that more data is needed for prudent decision-making is dilatory. There is no doubt that the threat exists, and there is a need for action now. And when reading David Stockman's part of his speech to the Business Council, or a National Business Council, that, well, what about those Adirondack lakes? Is it worth economically? Why can't we trade them off? I don't think that David Stockman understands that the citizens of the state of New York for over 100 years have invested billions of dollars into the preservation of the Adirondacks as a state and national resource.
David Stockman, our manager of budget, made some kind of a statement that, well, hey, you know, why the cost, is it worth it just for a few fish? I think you made a comment on that.
Yes, I think that's a very short-sighted statement, frankly, if that's an accurate quote from him. There are a lot of potential costs that are not even taken into consideration in that sort of statement. We're doing a lot of work now through a special unit that we've set up to look at the real economic costs in terms of the loss of tourism industry in those parts of our jurisdiction, perhaps the loss of some commercial fishing, the damage to man-made structures. There are a whole host of things where we are losing. And of course, once we've developed that information, we want to share it with our neighbors, because there are losses here that may not be being recognized at the present time either by Mr. Stockman and others.
Once the lakes have become acidified, it is a foregone conclusion that they will remain dead. However, an effort is being made to breathe some life back into them with lime. But the liming of the lakes may prove to be too little, too late.
For instance, one of the vice presidents of International Nickel Company, which operates at Sudbury, has suggested that we will not, indeed we cannot, act fast enough to stop the problem from getting worse. Therefore, we must develop protective measures for our lakes. Now, the only protective measure that has been canvassed very largely and has been attempted is the liming of lakes. And indeed, that may give limited protection to very small local areas. However, it is my conviction that there is no protective measure that can be widely and economically applied to save our lakes. Liming is only of limited value, limited local value, and there is no way in which we can lime the Laurentian Shield of Canada, nor is there any way in which we can lime most of Norway.
The State Department of Environmental Conservation is taking issue with the Federal Environmental Protection Agency for its stand on the acid rain issue. What's this confrontation about, the state versus the federal?
Well, under the existing federal legislation, each state has responsibility for its own air pollution control legislation. In effect, as long as that state meets its own standards, that is to say its own air quality standards, and meets the national goals, then the federal government can't do anything to impose more stringent standards. What the state of Ohio has done, for example, is to build very, very large stacks. Within the last 10 years, for example, about 500 very tall stacks have been built. Now, the tall stacks are effective in allowing a state such as Ohio, Kentucky, or Indiana to meet local standards, but the result is that much of the pollution goes higher into the atmosphere and comes down farther away. So Ohio is able to meet its standards, but the result is that the pollution lands in places like New York.
We have some coal-generating plants here in western New York. How do they rate?
Well, okay, let's take a look at them. First of all, in terms of the rules and regulations promulgated and implemented by DEC, they are all in compliance with our regulations because of the fuel they're using. In fact, in New York State, we regulate sulfur emissions by fuel use, sulfur in the fuel. I think that's an important point to keep in mind. And these facilities in western New York are in compliance with those regulations. Okay?
Yet they do give off emissions.
Absolutely. There's no question, again, as I've already said, that the major contribution, the major result of the sulfur in the fuel is going to end up in the off gases. There will be obviously some left in the ash, but very little.
Niagara-Mohawk today took the wraps off a new emission scrubber unit called a fuel gas desulfurization system. Though a highly costly installation at the Huntley plant on River Road, it could provide part of the answer to acid rain if the federal government forces plants in other states to meet national emission standards.
Basically, what the system does is use a absorbent which, when mixed with the flue gases, which contain certain amounts of sulfur dioxide, reacts with that sulfur dioxide, and then that absorbent can be regenerated and reused in the cycle. So one of the advantages of this type of system is that it reduces a potential environmental problem, and that is of trucking off these sludges that would normally be generated.
Now, this is quite an expensive undertaking. Is it strictly experimental right now? And do you have it on all of your burners or just one?
This is a demonstration that is put on one of our 100 megawatt units. We refer to it as a demonstration because it has been proven on laboratory scale components of the system have. This is the first attempt to put all of these components together on a large scale.
How much money are we talking about?
We're talking upwards of $55 billion. This is what the project has been funded for.
Why not pre-wash the coal or use a low sulfur coal to lessen the acid rain problem?
Well, again, the problem may not be coal burning, but however, we do wash coal, but there's a certain limit to the amount of sulfur that can be removed by washing. And beyond that, a system such as we have here would have to employ to actually attack the sulfur dioxide after it's been burned.
New York State is in the peculiar position of fighting the federal government over the amount of emissions coming from other states, which many say are killing our lakes. This state and Canada have become allies in the battle for clean air.
Now, with respect to acid rain, our office has begun the most significant legal assault against the problem of acid rain ever in the country's history. We have intervened now in 19 separate administrative proceedings where power companies in the Midwest are seeking to relax standards. They're seeking to get permission to produce even more sulfur dioxide into the air, and those sulfate particulates are carried by the wind into the northeastern part of the United States and are dropped here by the ton, by the tens of tons on the state of New York. And when they come in contact with moisture, it forms rain and it drops onto the ground, and the level of acidity is 1,000 times the normal acidity of rain that comes and falls into New York. And as a result, we've seen disastrous consequences here in our state. It affects the crops, the agriculture, it affects the health of people, it affects the quality of our water. High acidity in the water does not allow fish to survive. We've already tracked more than 240 lakes that are now dead. No fish can survive because of the level of acid in that water. And this impacts upon tourism and the economy. Acid rain helps debilitate and destroy our buildings, our facilities. There have been estimates that quantify the damage in the area of $5 billion for the Northeast. So this is a very substantial issue. And in addition to those administrative proceedings, we've sued on 4 cases in the federal courts of this country, challenging the EPA when they did allow relaxation and lessening of the standards of the Clean Air Act. And we feel very strongly that New York should be able to get the protection for its citizens of what the federal legislation is, and to ensure a decent environment.
I think that the lawsuits are good to the extent that they encourage action, but I'm not very hopeful that they're going to bring about any action. There's a difference between filing a lawsuit, having the court agree with you, and then getting someone to implement the decision. And if the executive branch of our government has that responsibility, with the Reagan administration, the prospects are not very good.
What are chances of a treaty dealing with transboundary pollution?
I would say right now the prospects are not very good. The other day, for example, Keith Norton, the Minister for the Environment for Ontario, said that he was opposed to acid rain, but his position was not negotiable. When you enter negotiations and say there's nothing that's subject to negotiation, the other side is not likely to want to negotiate. Equally important is the fact that some kind of treaty would require the United States to impose additional controls. There seems to be little doubt about that. And yet with the Reagan administration's efforts to reduce environmental controls, or at least to mitigate them, it seems unlikely that the Reagan administration will be willing to go forward with such a treaty.
That's a worrisome thing for us, because one of the principles set out was that there would be enforcement of existing laws and regulations with respect to emissions. With the moves on the part of the present administration to take actions to relax emissions, it's my feeling and my government's concern that they are not honoring that commitment.
Canadians now expect the United States to demonstrate the same degree of concern to address the problem. In short, we in Canada are convinced that we cannot resolve acid rain ourselves. We urgently need the cooperation of the United States. The importance of acid rain in Canada-US relations is also demonstrated by the attention it received during the visit of President Reagan to Ottawa in March. It was among the major bilateral issues discussed. I can assure you that Canada was pleased to receive the President's assurances that negotiation of an agreement to deal with the problem would proceed as planned, and that the United States wants to work cooperatively with Canada to understand and control air as well as water pollution. We regard this as an important commitment by the United States government.
Do you feel that the great pressure, the concern of Canada will put pressure to clean up our act here?
I do. I think Canada will be a great ally with us. President Reagan, early on in his administration, as one of the first ventures outside the continental United States, went to our neighboring and very friendly country in Canada and visited with Prime Minister Trudeau. And I think their concern and their very strong relationship historically with us can be an added catalyst and ally in our struggle to try to stop the perpetuation and indeed increase in the problem of acid rain.
Is there a proven link between utility emissions and lake acidification like we have up in the Adirondacks? Is there a link? Can we prove that the emissions from these plants are causing these lakes to become acidified?
Yes, the Department of Environmental Conservation here in New York State has documented the level of acidity and where it has come from and what it has done to lakes. And it's not only in the Adirondacks, but it's in other parts of the state as well. I was recently in Montgomery and Fulton County, where people were talking about the damage to their lakes and the damage to their water supply. We've even traced the fact that the high level of acidity that comes into the ground and finds its way into wells and into water pipes causes corrosion of those pipes, and lead and zinc and other materials get into the water and affects the quality and the taste of that water. So this is a very substantial issue that has manifold ramifications.
Now, is there a threat of further problems in the future?
Yes, there is indeed. Now, the major economic threat is that over several decades to a century or two, if we let the problem go on, there will be appreciable damage to forest productivity. Now, I'd like to stress that there's no convincing evidence, conclusive evidence, that this is happening now. There are suggestive bits of evidence coming out of Scandinavia, out of Germany, out of the New Jersey pine barrens that we may be seeing damage, but it's not conclusive. But everything we know about these poor forest soils on sensitive rocks suggests that over time there's a natural process of impoverishment by acidification, by natural acidification, and acid rain can only hasten that process. Well, I think the Canadians have suddenly realized they've had a problem. They were rather intransigent just as recently as a couple of years ago over some of these problems. They have suddenly realized that their country is extremely sensitive. And we have not recognized that although we don't have the same degree of sensitivity across the United States, there are areas that are extremely susceptible. And it's up to people in those areas to lean on their legislators to get a consensus with legislators elsewhere. This will mean trade-offs of various kinds, but it's a process that can't begin too soon.
Whatever solution is proposed or whatever solution is implemented is going to be very costly, and it's going to cause some dislocation. But I think what one has to consider is what are the consequences of not solving the problem. The Canadians are very adamant that some solution is necessary, and I think the Americans would be as well if they realized the extent of the problem. A lot of people like to go to the Adirondacks for the fishing and so forth. If there's nothing there to fish, if the lakes are acidic, then perhaps New York State is going to lose millions of dollars in tourist trade.
Well, for starters, we have to not allow any further exacerbation or increase in the problem. And that's what we're faced with and threatened with today by having 19 separate power plants in 7 different Midwestern states saying, we want to even put more sulfur dioxide into the air. If we've already found 240 some odd lakes that are now dead, if Canada is so concerned, think what's going to happen if the EPA allows the relaxation further of standards. So I think we've got to, just fight to deal even with and to maintain the status quo. We're going to have a defensive and rearguard action just to keep the Clean Air Act.
Well, my view of the solution, not as a scientist, but as an interested citizen and resident alien here, is that we have to reduce emissions of sulfur and nitrogen oxides by fossil fuel combustion. There is no other way. We cannot remedy the situation by liming our lakes. We can't lime the Precambrian shield of Canada. We can't lime the whole of Norway. It's a local palliative, not a solution. So we have to reduce emissions by whatever means are practicable.
We're not prepared to fiddle while Rome burns. We're prepared to launch and have begun what we regard as an all-out war on acid rain. Sit on the shore of a particular lake, maybe in Ontario's Muskoka area or New York's Adirondacks. On the surface, the water appears crystal clear, almost shimmering in the sunlight. But look down beneath the surface. There are no fish, no small water creatures, no plants. In short, there's no life at all. The lake is dead. And that is not a future projection. We have lakes in that state.